The fog came in off the Atlantic the same hour. Cordelia Thornberry decided she'd sooner sink her father's boat than sit through one more blind date. And she had no idea the man who'd haul her off the rocks that night was the very date she'd spent all week dreading. She was 38, and on paper, she had everything. Thornberry Strategic Capital ran out of a glass tower on Bay Street, and that morning, from a boardroom in Halifax, Cordelia had finished swallowing a heritage shipbuilder whole. Maitland Marine, 4 generations old, mismanaged into the ground by men who'd never once stood on the floor of their own yard. She'd signed the term sheet at 9, watched the founder's grandson go gray across the table, and felt nothing. Not triumph, not even the cold little hum she used to get, just the familiar hollow, like a held breath that never got let out. Her best friend Nadia called it a problem. "You need a tether, Cora," she'd said on the phone, in that voice she used when she'd already decided something on Cordelia's behalf. "Not a deal. A person. I set you up. Tonight. Le Sextant, 8 o'clock. He's a single dad, he fixes things for a living, he has never once heard of you, and that is the whole point. No agenda, no angle. Wear the Navy thing. Don't you dare cancel." Cordelia had hated the idea on principle. She despised feeling watched, and a blind date was nothing but an hour of being watched by a stranger who'd already heard her last name and started doing math. So she did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She told her driver she wouldn't need him. She left her phone charging in the suite, and she drove herself down the South Shore in the only thing she still owned that her father's hands had touched. A 31-foot wooden sloop named Mireille, after her mother, that the old man had rebuilt plank by plank in a rented shed the last decade of his life. It was the one thing she never let anyone else captain. She'd planned to take it out for an hour off Harlow's Cove, just to feel the wheel kick under her palms, just to be somebody before she had to go back to being something. Clear her head before the dinner she didn't want. The forecast had said the front would hold off till midnight. The forecast was wrong. The squall hit fast, the way they do down there. Wind backing hard out of the southeast, the harbor going from pewter to black, rain coming sideways in ropes. Cordelia knew enough to turn for the cove, and she nearly made it. Then the old auxiliary diesel coughed once, knocked twice, and quit, and the silence under the screaming wind was the most frightening sound she'd ever heard. No engine, no phone. A wooden boat full of 70 years of her family's grief, driving stern first toward a black tooth of granite. She could hear before she could see. 100 meters up the shore road, Jonah Cormier was running late to the worst night of his month. He was 35, and he ran Cormier Boatworks the way his father had before the cancer. A leaning shed and a marine railway on the lip of Harlow's Cove, where he restored cedar strip canoes and patched up lobster boats, and, 3 weeks out of 4, made just enough to not quite cover what he owed. His wife had been gone 2 years, not dead, just gone, west with a man who sold software, leaving Jonah with a stack of debt and the only thing in the world that mattered. A 7-year-old named Pearl, who was, at that exact moment, asleep at his sister's place across the harbor, clutching the wooden seal he'd carved her for her birthday. His sister Tess had cornered him about the date, the way she cornered him about everything, which was relentlessly and out of love. "You can't raise that child inside a boat shed, Jonah. You're going to wake up 50, and the only thing you'll have talked to in 10 years is an outboard. Her name's Cordelia. She's some finance person up from Toronto, smart, no kids, no baggage. Le Sextant. 8. I already told her you'd be there, so. Le Sextant." Even the name turned his stomach. He'd looked it up. The cheapest thing on the menu was a $40 plate of 3 scallops, arranged like an art installation, and he had $110 to last till Thursday, and a foreclosure letter from the credit union sitting on his bench like an accusation. He dreaded all of it, the room full of people who'd glance at his good jacket and know in half a second it was his only one, the moment this Cordelia would ask what he did, and he'd watch her file him under charity. He was driving into town along the shore road, wipers losing the fight, already rehearsing his excuses, when his headlights swept the cove and caught something out on the water that did not belong there. Chrome winch fittings. A varnished hull, mast whipping, no running lights, driving backward toward the sisters. The two rocks every kid in Harlow's Cove learned to fear before they learned to swim. Jonah didn't think. He just stopped the truck. By the time he'd run the railway down and shoved his own skiff into the surf, he was soaked to the bone and his good jacket was finished, and he didn't care. He knew that water like he knew the inside of his own chest. He came up under the sloop's lee, threw a line he'd thrown 10,000 times, and made it fast to the bow cleat in one motion, and then he was hauling, the little outboard screaming, dragging 31 feet of stubborn wood off the rocks meter by grudging meter with the granite close enough to spit on. He got her into the lee of the breakwater, got 2 fenders down, came alongside, and found himself looking up into the face of a woman who was soaked through a coat that probably cost more than his truck, white-knuckled on a ship's wheel, eyes wide and furious and not crying, which somehow he respected immediately. "You're all right," he shouted over the wind. "You're off the rocks. I've got you." "I'm fine," she shouted back, which was so obviously a lie that he almost laughed. She had a death grip on a wheel attached to an engine that wasn't running, in a storm, 50 meters from rocks, and her first instinct was to inform him she was fine. He clocked it for what it was, not arrogance exactly. "Armor." "Sure," he said. "Throw me your stern line anyway, would you, before Fine puts us both on the sisters." That got her. She moved. She knew boats. He could see it in how she handled the line, no fumbling, a real clove hitch. And that surprised him, the way her hands knew things her coat said they shouldn't. He got them both tucked behind the breakwater and rafted up, and only then, in the relative quiet, did he get a proper look at the boat and feel something go still in him. He set his palm flat on the coaming, on the varnish, and he knew. He'd know that work anywhere. "This is a McCaskill hull," he said, almost to himself. "Restored. Somebody spent 10 years on this, probably more. Look at the scarf joints. You can't even find them. That's not a yard job. That's somebody who loved it." Cordelia stared at him. The rain ran off both their faces. "My father," she said, and her voice did something it never did in boardrooms. It came out small. "He built her back from a wreck. He died before he finished the cabin." Jonah looked at the unfinished cabin trim, at the careful pencil lines still ghosted on the wood where the old man had marked his next cut and never made it, and he felt the foolishness of every excuse he'd rehearsed in the truck. "Then we're not letting her go on the rocks tonight," he said quietly. "Hold the light for me." She didn't ask which light or why. She found his waterproof torch where he pointed, climbed down into the engine well beside him, without a word about the McQueen coat she was kneeling in, and held the beam steady on the old diesel while he worked. Up close she smelled of rain and cold and something expensive underneath, and he was very aware of how small the engine well was and how close they were. "You don't have to be down here," he said. "It's filthy." "I don't sit topside while someone else fixes my problem," she said, and held the light dead steady. What's wrong with her? He'd already heard it. He'd heard it before he touched a thing. That knock, then the quit. "Fuel," he said. "Water in the fuel. These old sabs, they'll run on anything till they won't, and 1 cup of water in the line and she drowns. Your filter's a sock full of jelly." He had the bleed screw open, was already cracking the line, working the lift pump by hand, bleeding her down with a rag pressed to catch the spill. "She's not dead. She's just got water in her lungs. Most things people scrap. That's all that's wrong with them. Water where the fuel should be." "That sounds," Cordelia said slowly, watching his hands, "like the most depressing summary of my entire industry I've ever heard." He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, and it startled her, the warmth of it in all that cold. "What's your industry?" he asked, working the pump. "Capital," she said. "I find broken things, and I either fix them or I take them apart for the pieces." A beat. "Mostly the second one lately. And tonight? Tonight I'm supposed to be in town, being charming at a man I've never met, at a restaurant I hate, as a favor to a friend who thinks I'm dying inside." She said it before she could stop herself, and then looked appalled that she had. Jonah's hands paused on the pump. Something cold moved through his chest that had nothing to do with the rain, a thought too absurd to hold. He let it go. The whole province had blind dates tonight. The whole province hated Le Sextant. "Funny," he said, and reached up and gave the flywheel a turn. "I'm on my way to the worst night of my year for the same reason." Sister set me up. Some finance shark from away. I've been dreading it since Tuesday. The engine caught, sputtered, caught again, and then settled into a slow, throaty, beautiful idle, and he watched relief break across the woman's face like sun. There she is. Oh, thank God, Cordelia breathed, and for 1 second she wasn't a CEO at all. She was just a person who'd nearly lost the last thing her father gave her and hadn't. He showed her how to baby the throttle, how to run for the wharf, how to listen for the knock so she'd know before it happened next time. He coiled his lines. The rain was easing, just a little, the worst of the front sliding north. At the wharf, soaked, idling, neither of them quite ready to go, she pulled a folded silk square out of her ruined coat, a handkerchief, monogrammed, the kind nobody carried anymore, and held it out to him. Your hands, she said. He looked at the grease ground into every line of his palms and at the white silk and shook his head. I'll wreck it. It's already a casualty, she said. It was my father's. He'd have liked that it went to the man who saved his boat. She pressed it into his hand, and her cold fingers brushed his, and they both noticed and neither said anything. I'm Cora, Jonah, he said. Drive her slow, Cora. And get that fuel polished before you take her out again, or next time I might not be standing on the road. Good luck with your finance shark, she said, and smiled. A real one, the first in weeks, she'd realize later. Good luck with your charming stranger, he said, and meant it. They went their separate ways, but not opposite ways, because Harlow's Cove had exactly one road into Halifax, and they both took it, 20 minutes apart. Neither one knowing the other was ahead of them in the dark, both of them already a little late for the same table. Le Sextant sat over the harbor with floor-to-ceiling glass, and a string trio in the corner, and a maitre d'ade, who looked at Jonah's destroyed jacket the way you'd look at a wet dog tracking through a wedding. The cheap seats were $40 scallops. Jonah gave the name Thornberry, party of two, and watched the man's eyebrows climb at the name and drop at the man, and got seated at a back booth by the windows with a basket of bread he was afraid to eat in case it cost extra. He ordered tap water. He checked his cracked phone. 8:20. He hoped, actually hoped, that this Cordelia would stand him up so he could go home, peel off the ruined jacket, kiss his sleeping daughter's forehead, and forget the whole humiliating night. He had not connected the woman on the boat to the name on the reservation because the woman on the boat had said her name was Cora, and Cora was not Cordelia, not yet, not in his head. And then the trio stuttered, and the room dipped its voice the way a room does, and he looked up. She dried her hair in the car, changed into the navy dress that had been folded in a garment bag in her trunk this whole time. But the coat over her arm was the same ruined coat, and the eyes were the same eyes. And Jonah Cormier put down his glass of tap water very, very carefully because his hands had stopped working. Cordelia stopped 6 feet from the table with one hand on the back of an empty chair like the floor had tilted. Cora, he said. Jonah, she said. And then she started to laugh, not politely, not a boardroom laugh, but a real one, helpless, a hand over her mouth, the laugh of a woman who has just watched the universe play an absurd and merciful joke. You're the single dad who fixes things. You're the one, Tess. You're the finance shark, he said, and a grin broke across his face that took 10 years off it. You're the one my sister's been threatening me with all week. Nadia set you up. Nadia set you up with me. They set us up with each other, Cordelia said, sinking into the seat across from him. And we already met on a rock in a hurricane. She shook her head. Of all the boats on the South Shore, in my defense, Jonah said, I'd have stopped for anyone. You just happened to be the one I was dreading meeting in a nice shirt. He gestured down at the wreck of his jacket, which I no longer have. So, you've seen the worst of it already. The waiter came. Jonah opened the menu and felt the blood leave his face. A strip loin at $62, a salt-baked fish for the table at a number he had to read twice, and across from him Cordelia, who had spent 20 years reading exactly this expression on the faces of men she was about to outbid, saw the small flinch in his jaw and understood everything in half a second. She closed her menu. We won't be staying for dinner, she told the waiter, in a voice that wasn't rude but left no door open. Just put a bottle of the Tidal Bay on my account and we'll get out of your hair. When the waiter had gone, she leaned across the white linen. Don't, she said quietly, before Jonah could speak. Don't do the thing where you offer to pay for half of a meal neither of us wants. I despise this place. The portions are an insult, and half the men in this room owe me money. I only said yes to it because it was public and I could leave fast. You sure know how to make a man feel courted, he said. I'm out of practice, she admitted, badly. But I'll tell you what I'm not out of practice at, and that's knowing when I'd rather be somewhere else. She tilted her head, and the armor was all the way off now, and there was just a tired, funny, sharp-eyed woman looking at him like he was the most interesting thing in the room. You said your daughter likes burgers. He blinked. Pearl. Yeah. She'd live on them if I let her. There is a wharf shack down on the waterfront, Cordelia said, standing. That does a fried haddock burger that should be illegal, and a chowder that I would trade this entire restaurant for, and I am buying, and I will hear nothing about it because I nearly drowned tonight and I've earned a burger. And that was nearly the end of it, except that as they crossed the room a shadow fell over them, and a voice like cold honey said, Cordelia, slumming, are we? She turned, and her whole face changed back to granite. Standing there in a suit that fit too well was a silver-haired man with a smile that never reached his eyes. Gareth Price, the activist investor who'd spent 6 months trying to wedge his way onto her board and had lost, that very afternoon, the proxy fight for Maitland Marine. He had 2 soft, well-fed men behind him, the kind who laughed when Gareth laughed. Gareth, Cordelia said, still upright. I'd assumed the day's events would have finished you. Gareth's eyes slid to Jonah, to the ruined jacket, the grease in his nail beds, and his smile widened in a way that made the back of Jonah's neck go hot. And who's this? Surely not a new acquisition, Cordelia. He looks a bit pre-owned. Don't tell me Thornbury Capital's opened a wing for the maritime unfortunate. Cordelia's hand was halfway to a wine glass before she caught herself. Gareth, you're going to want to walk away before. It's all right, Cora. Jonah's voice was easy. He didn't shrink. He looked at Gareth the way he'd look at a hull somebody had slapped 100 coats of paint over to hide the rot, and then he nodded at the man's wrist. That's a nice watch. Gareth's smile flickered, uncertain at the change of subject. It's a Patek. It is, Jonah agreed pleasantly. Second hand's lagging, though. Half a beat. See it? That's the mainspring drying out. Happens when a man buys a fine machine to be looked at instead of to be wound. He let it sit a second. You can put a $60,000 case around it, but anybody who's spent real time with real machines can hear when there's nothing running inside. Enjoy your evening, Gareth. The 2 soft men behind Gareth found something very interesting to look at on the ceiling. Gareth went the color of a boiled lobster, opened his mouth, found nothing in it, and turned and walked away fast. And Cordelia watched the whole thing, with an expression Jonah would think about for a long time afterward, like she'd just watched someone do, effortlessly, and in 12 seconds, the thing she spent millions of dollars and entire quarters trying to do. You, she said, as the door of Le Sextant closed behind them and the harbor air hit their faces. Are a genuinely dangerous man. I work on stubborn old engines all day, Jonah said. He's just a stubborn old engine that thinks it's a person. The doryman was everything Le Sextant wasn't. A clapboard shack on the wharf with a buzzing sign, cracked vinyl booths, and the heavy, holy smell of frying fish and good coffee. The man at the flat top, an enormous bearded fellow named Stan, looked up and hollered, Jonah Cormier, where in God's name have you been? And didn't blink at the woman in the navy dress sliding into the booth beside him. Cordelia ate a fried haddock burger with both hands and her eyes closed, and got tartar sauce on her thumb and laughed about it, and looked, in the bad fluorescent light, more alive than she had in a glass tower in 2 years. Jonah stole her chips. She let him. They talked, really talked, the way you only can after you've nearly died together and seen each other at your absolute worst before you saw each other in nice clothes. She told him about her father, who'd run a marine supply store in Lunenburg before he ever ran anything bigger, who taught her to splice line and read a barometer, who'd left her a company she'd grown into an empire and a wooden boat she'd never finished, and how she sometimes thought she'd got the 2 things backward, that the boat was the inheritance and the empire was the wreck. She told him about the Hollow, about signing deals that should have felt like winning and feeling nothing. He told her about Pearl, about the carved seal and the Lego canoes and the way his daughter asked every single night whether the shop was going to be okay, because 7-year-olds always know more than you think. He told her about the letter from the credit union sitting on his bench, $40,000 in 2 weeks, or the railway and the shed and his father Al's name over the door all went to the bank. Why fight for it? She asked, not unkindly, the way only someone in finance would ask. You're clearly good enough to walk into any yard in the country tomorrow. Steady check. No letters from the bank. Why bleed your knuckles for a shed? Because my dad built it with his hands and he taught me the thing nobody teaches anymore, Jonah said. When something's broken, you don't throw it out. You take the time to learn it. You find where the water got in. You put in the work and you bring it back. And it's better for having been broken, because now somebody understands it all the way down. He turned his coffee cup in his rough hands. I want Pearl to grow up knowing some things are worth not giving up on, even when the numbers say otherwise. Maybe especially then. Cordelia was quiet a long moment. Then she reached across the cracked formica and laid her hand over his, grease and all, and didn't move it. Pearl is a very lucky kid, she said, to have a father who fixes things instead of scrapping them. They stayed till Stan started flipping chairs onto tables. He drove her back to the wharf, where Muriel rode quiet at her lines, the storm long gone, the harbor glass flat under a sky going pale at the edges. She stood on the float a moment in the ruined coat. Thank you, Jonah, she said, for the boat, for getting me out of that restaurant, for the burger, she stopped, for seeing it was my father's work and saying so. Nobody's said so in 8 years. Anytime, Cora, he said, and meant the word more than he'd ever meant it. And if she takes on water again, you know where the shed is. I do, she said, and there was a promise in it. I really do. Then she did something neither of them planned. She stepped up onto the truck's running board, and she kissed him. Once, soft, brief, her cold hand against his jaw, and stepped down before he could decide what to do with his hands, and turned and went down the float to her father's boat without looking back. And Jonah Cormier drove home along the empty shore road with a destroyed jacket, a silk handkerchief in his pocket, and the dazed look of a man who's just had the entire shape of his life rearranged by a woman in a navy dress. He didn't hear from her for 4 days. He told himself that was right. Women like Cordelia Thornberry went back to glass towers. Men like him went back to grease pits and final notices. Fairy tales didn't happen to men who smelled of diesel and dock water. On the 5th day, the foreclosure deadline a week out, and his stomach a fist of dread, Jonah was in the shed sanding a canoe gunwale, while Pearl sat cross-legged on the bench building a Lego boat and narrating its dramatic sinking, when a sound came up the cove road that stopped his hand mid-stroke. Not a car. A throaty, knocking, beautiful diesel idol he'd have known anywhere. He came out into the doorway. Mireille was nosing up to his wharf under her own power, and at her wheel, in jeans and a heavy fisherman's sweater and rubber boots, no coat that cost more than his truck, was Cordelia Thornberry, looking like she'd been born on that float. She made fast, a real clove hitch, and came up the ramp with a thick envelope under her arm, and crouched first to admire Pearl's Lego boat with complete seriousness, asking whether those were the new bilge pumps, and Pearl, delighted, explained that you had to build the bottom right or the whole thing came apart. And Cordelia said her father was a smart man, and stood up and looked at Jonah. You polished the fuel, he said, because his voice had gone somewhere. I listened for the knock the whole way down, she said. Like you said. She set the envelope on his bench, right beside the bank's letter, where he couldn't pretend not to see it. I have a problem, Jonah. Okay, I bought a shipyard last week. Maitland Marine in Lunenburg, 4 generations old, and the last 2 ran it into the seabed. Heritage hulls, wooden boats, the kind of work nobody alive knows how to do properly anymore. I've got 200 employees, a half-finished schooner the province cares deeply about, and a maintenance and restoration division that is being run by a man who could not tell a scarf joint from a sandwich. She tapped the envelope. That's a contract. Master restorer and yard consultant, 3 years, full restoration of the schooner your rate, with a signing retainer large enough to make a very small banking matter disappear entirely. Jonah stared at the envelope. Cora, I can't take a handout. I won't. It is not a handout, she said, and her voice went flat and certain, the boardroom voice, but her eyes weren't boardroom at all. I do not make sentimental investments. I watched you pull 31 feet of wooden boat off the sisters in a gale and diagnose a fuel fault by ear in the dark. You are the best wooden boatman in this province and possibly the country, and you are about to be put out of business by a letter, and I have a national heritage schooner rotting in a shed, and nobody who loves it enough to save it right. This is the most coldly rational acquisition I have made all year. She paused, and the mask slipped all the way off, and the woman from the diner was there again. Also, she said quieter, I needed an excuse to come back, and I knew you'd never accept an invitation to Le Sextant. A slow grin found its way onto Jonah's face, the dread of a hard morning lifting off him like fog burning back. He looked down at the contract, at his father's name over the door, at his daughter narrating a shipwreck on the workbench, at the woman in rubber boots who'd come up the cove under the power of her dead father's engine. You're right, he said, stepping close enough that he could smell the rain and salt of her again. I hate that restaurant. But I know a wharf shack that does a haddock burger that should be illegal. It's a date, Cordelia said, and this time when she leaned in there was nothing brief about it, and Pearl, on the bench, looked up from her Lego boat and announced to nobody in particular that she had built the bottom right, so the whole thing was going to float. What Jonah Cormier understood, standing in his father's shed with sawdust in the air and a contract on the bench and a woman's hand in his greased one, was something his old man had tried to teach him with every plank he ever steamed and bent. The best things in your life don't arrive finished, off a showroom floor, perfect and paid for. They come to you broken, driving stern first toward the rocks in the dark, full of water where the fuel should be, waiting for somebody patient enough to find the split, and stubborn enough not to scrap them, and willing to do the slow work of bringing them back, one plank, one season, one ordinary day at a time. And out past the breakwater the schooner waited in its shed in Lunenburg, half-built and patient, and Gareth Price nursed his humiliation in a downtown office, and had not, it would turn out, walked away for good, but that was a storm for another season, and tonight the harbor was glass, and the burgers were on Cordelia, and for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was dreading a single thing.